Welcome to the RSP Film and Theory. We are back, the Hedgehog and the Fox, or the Fox and the Hedgehog, or otherwise known as the Fantasy Writer of the Year in 2024, Adam Harstad. And, at least in our industry's eyes, maybe in his son's eyes, his son's a little bit more skeptical of him, but that's what happens with family. But we're glad to have Adam back. And this week, I think what we're going to do is kind of echo the sentiments of one of our listeners who so aptly said, I wish you guys did these more in the off season because I feel like I only get to hear topics about where I fucked up because you guys weren't on during the off season to talk about things. So today we're going to talk about topics about like we fucked up because you guys took time off. What did we do wrong and how do we fix it? So we'll talk about managing September and redraft and Dynasty and some other fun topics always with Adam. So, again, thanks for joining me. And it's my fault most of the time that we're off because there's a little booklet that I do during the off season. So, and then I need a break. But Adam, I'm so glad to have you.
Yeah, it's good. It's nice to. I'm excited for the season to kick off and for us to start settling into a routine. Because the off season, it's nice because there's that limitless possibility. Like you can do anything, and when I can do anything, I don't do anything because there's too much that I can. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting the routine and having my prospective options a little bit more limited.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back and we'll say from January through August. There's limitless things in where we can fuck up our dynasty team. But what are some common things that maybe we could review with folks who either aren't familiar with our show or maybe they needed to hear it again about some things that you would look at and say, here's some things that are common in dynasty league formats that maybe people get a little too far over their skis, whether it's the draft, free agency, trades, different types of roster management things that that they may have to dig themselves out of a little bit of a hole come the start of the season.
Yeah, my two biggest and oldest rules in Dynasty are number one, draft for talent, trade for need. And number two, the corollary is nobody has needs in June. Nobody has needs in July. If you're not submitting a lineup, you don't have needs. And I see a lot of people who are looking at their team in May or June when the rookie draft's on, and they're like, I think the best player on the board right now is this guy, but I really a running back. And so I'm going to spend this pick on the running back because that's what I need. And the reality is the best way to get a running back in Dynasty is to draft a bunch of good players and then trade one for a running back, right? You would rather draft a good wide receiver who you can trade for a good running back than draft a bad running back. I had, in our staff Dynasty League, started in 2013. I have never spent a top 30 draft pick on a running back in that league's history, just because it hasn't worked out that way. I'm not opposed to the position. I probably like running backs more than most dynasty players because most players think they have shorter careers than they actually do, as our friend Derrick Henry can attest.
Right.
But so I'm not averse to them. It's just typically the good running backs go very early in the draft, and this is not a humble brag. This is just a straight up brag. Typically I'm drafting very late in the draft. So I've just never been in a position where there was a good running back who I liked. And despite this, people are like, well, okay, but your running backs must be trash. You must be winning with wide receivers. And no, I had Austin Eckler. I had Jonathan Taylor. I just got him by trading. I drafted Michael Thomas and then traded him for Alvin Kamara. And that's the best way to get a good running back like Alvin Kamara. So that's my number one thing is just when you're on the clock in your dynasty rookie draft, don't look at your team at all. Just don't look at your team. Ask yourself, who do I think is most likely to still be contributing, to still be a viable fantasy starter 3-4 years down the road? Who's going to produce the most points, produce the most production, and get that guy? And if it winds up being a guy at a position that you've got quote unquote too much of, okay, then you have options. You have, you can either trade that guy, or maybe he makes one of your other guys expendable and you can trade that guy. And having good players gives you options, and you can fix the distribution later. And also, I would say, if you think you have a bunch of good players at that position, you're probably wrong. Things happen. I went into last year with Austin Eckler, and I'm like, oh, I'm set at running back. And then, Eckler kind of fell off pretty hard. And it turns out like, oh, no, actually, I wasn't quite as set at running back as I thought. Everything is a need.
Yeah, and I think that I love those points because it's also it kind of parallels what I talk about in the RSP a lot, which is stock. It's the same thing: stockpiling depth at a position, stockpiling a strength. If you have a strength and you don't think you're going to be able to have the draft capital to acquire the best talent at a weakness, then keep building on that strength. I mean, examples I could give of that is, in a dynasty league that I've won multiple times in a short span, I didn't draft Nick Chubb or Jonathan Taylor. I traded for them. And I was in a one quarterback league where I stockpiled quarterbacks to the point that it became ridiculous depth, and people were coming to me for trades because I literally had 4 of the 6 top quarterbacks in that league, and there was a talent disparity as a result of that. So I could trade who I perceived my worst quarterback to be for a strong running back. Or looking at teams in redraft. I mean, last year there's a team, there's the Dirty Dozen Experts League, which is about a 30-year-old, writers league, and I'm this 2-time reigning champion of that heading into the draft last night. It's a keeper league with three players, but I didn't keep any running backs, and last year I missed my first round pick because I was traveling, and I mispicked the wrong Dalton at tight end and said, well, I'll go ahead and take Sam Laporta over here instead of since I missed on not getting Dalton Kincaid and pick Dalton Schultz. But even then, the running backs that guided my team at the end, Raheem Mostert, who I could get ridiculously late because, as you said, old running back, that, and people didn't really care for having old running backs. So, those are perfect examples of that. I mean, I also think that one of the things that you talk about too is trading. Looking at, I'm more of a believer that I don't like to trade before the season starts unless it's just a ridiculously good deal. Like if someone's offering you an IDP league Myles Garrett for a song, you're going to take that. But otherwise, if it's just you've got the itch to try and make a deal, don't do that. Wait and assess. Mid-season to me is probably one of the best times to trade. That's the truest reveal for like a fair deal. Now, if you're like just a good negotiator and trade all the time and trade your way in and out of trouble, then maybe the volume of trades, as you've talked about a lot, can work out well in your favor. But if you're a little bit more conservative with your negotiations, waiting until mid-season gives you the truest reveal of what you need, what they need, and there's no bullshitting around among within yourself most of the time. And that's usually what happens when people turn you down. It's not that they're trying to fool you, I think. It's that they're fooling themselves as to what they perceive the value of those players to be. And I think mid-season comes around, people kind of look around and go, okay, I really need this to help my team contend. And they drop all pretense of what they hope could happen.
And you'll see a lot too, like somebody's in June looking at their lineup and imagining, their opening day roster, and they're like, oh, I'm not feeling really good at running back. And so they'll trade for a running back in June, and then that guy loses his job in camps. He gets usurped by in June, it's not a solution. That's why I always say nobody has needs in June. Your need in June is maximize talent. I would even say in September, like right now, we're setting our lineup for week 1. And so it's real. Like if you have a liability, you're putting that liability on the field right now. And it's very easy to say like, oh, this is a need. But even in week 1, I mean, so many people that we think are sure things are going to lose their job over the next 3 weeks. And if you trade for them now, you haven't fixed anything. So and also too, there's this belief. I think the most common approach to Dynasty is I want to be maybe not strong everywhere, but I don't want any weaknesses, right?
Right.
I'm going to win this league by having a good, competent starter in every position. But the nature of distributions in the NFL is such that like leagues are not won by the team with the fewest weaknesses. Leagues are won by the team with the most strengths. Like a
Yeah.
team with Christian McCaffrey and the number 40 running back last year outscored a team with the number 11 and number 12 running backs because McCaffrey was so far ahead of the pack that you could start. I mean, you could, like, the most extreme example in 2006, the year LaDainian Tomlinson had that monster season, you could have started LaDainian Tomlinson and me at running back, and you would have outscored somebody who had like the number 7 and number 8 running backs.
Yeah.
It's just, it's okay to have, and it feels bad. I get it. Like, I've submitted lineups with guys in there and I'm like, that's the best I can do, and it feels bad. But I would encourage people to kind of embrace that feeling, because a bad starter is an opportunity for easy improvement. Like if your worst starter is terrible, it's pretty easy to go from terrible to kind of mediocre. Whereas if your worst starter is kind of mediocre, it's a lot harder to go from kind of mediocre to actually pretty good.
Yeah, because the decision making is much tougher in terms of who to pick up, who might be a little better than your mediocre
Right.
guy, and now you're vacillating between guys who are up and down each week, and you don't really know who's clearly the better option to roll with, and you're overanalyzing it. And I think that's a great point, and it's one of those things that's why you look at anchor. To me, I look at anchors for building a dynasty roster. You look at your scoring system and you decide which positions really do you need to have as your long-term high-scoring anchors, and try and aim for that. And you're not going to get all of them, but if 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 quarterback is one of those positions, probably then you would go for that. Tight end in in a performance tight end league certainly is going to give you some of those opportunities. But then, for me, usually, say I'm in I usually do lots of IDP leagues. So for me, I'm looking at as anchors is I want to build as strong of a receiving core as possible, and as strong of a linebacking core as possible. And I will trade and draft as much of those talents as I can, and then work my way into getting the other positions as needed if I don't land them, but in a startup, and get the value that I'm looking for. And then I'll do the same if I think there's a dominant tight end in the landscape. 10 years ago, it was easy to go, I'm going to build a stockpile of wide receivers, and now I'm going to trade that and something that I've unearthed, at another position, and get Rob Gronkowski, and feel good about doing that, and now you've solidified your team. Now, maybe the landscape has narrowed a fair bit in terms of there's a lot of good tight ends out there, but nobody unbelievably dominant at this stage, maybe at least in our perception as it is right now. So you just want to look for those types of anchors, and I'd say for IDP, most of the time linebacker and wide receiver are probably the ways to go, and then you can kind of stockpile your way into getting other positions.
Yeah, and I don't tend to look at it by position. I tend to look at it by player.
Yeah.
Okay, Patrick Mahomes does not play a premium position, but Patrick Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes. He's going to be doing the same thing 5 years from now that he's doing today. You don't really need to worry about him.
Yep.
I've been saying for forever, Patrick Mahomes, usually his startup dynasty cost in one quarterback leagues, forever has been late second or even into the third. And I'm like, the thing about Mahomes is you can draft him today and get 4 years of high-end quarterback one production, and his value's still going to be in the late second, early third. You could trade him for exactly what you what you paid to get him, and basically just got 4 years of free production. I get that quarterbacks aren't as valuable in that, but production only costs you something if a player is losing value over time.
Yeah.
And anytime you get a young star, their value is not going to lose. They're not going to lose value over time. All of their production is free.
Whether it's like having Dan Marino way back in the day.
Right. Yeah. If it's at a premium position like Justin Jefferson, great. That's fantastic. That's ideal. If it's at a quote unquote non-premium position, it's still free production. So I tend to try to find guys on my team who, and it's very rare for me to be confident, because the NFL is such a high turnover league.
Yep.
You know, there's very few players I can look at right now and be like, I'm pretty confident that this guy's still going to be a high end producer in 3 years. And if it's one of those guys that meets that threshold, I don't even really care about position. I just want as many of those guys as possible because it's free production. And those are kind of the anchors that I try to build around is how many players can I get where, like, I'm just confident these guys are going to hold value. They're not going to go anywhere. All of their production is going to be free, and fill my team with as much of them as possible. And then once those blocks are in place, okay, now we're starting to make sacrifices. Now production is coming at a cost. What kind of short-term fill-ins can I do to kind of fill in the gaps on the rest of my team?
Sure, absolutely. So how about how you manage in September when you look at the waiver wire? You know, we've talked about this last year, but it's always a good reminder for folks is, you know, in redraft and in Dynasty, but especially redraft to start. Let's start with that. Is that, you know, what's your strategy with when to pivot off of players, when to hold the course with them, how you look at spending on waivers? I think I just talked about 3 topics that could take probably about 15-20 minutes for us to discuss, but whatever, we got time. So tell me about it.
Waivers are pretty straightforward for me. If you look at, and I encourage people to go through your league's history and look at all the waiver claims for the last year and the year before that and year before that. And if you do that, you're going to quickly see, like, you're going to see names and you're going to, somebody spent 80% of their budget on that guy. The reality is that 90% of waiver claims are going to be spectacular failures. They're going to get you 0 value over the course of the year. There are very rare exceptions who wind up, you know, they start off on waivers and they turn into league winners. Like, you know, James Conner, the year that Le'Veon Bell held out for the entire year.
Williams last year.
Kyron Williams
Puka,
last year, exactly.
Yeah.
They're definitely, or Puka, yeah, great example. There's guys who come off of waivers to be league winners, but the first thing you're going to notice about them is usually it's not the guys we expect. Most commonly, the quote unquote league winners who come off waivers go for like 5% of the waiver budget, 10% of the waiver budget, a week or two before they really break out. They're speculative ads. And then the second thing you're going to notice is almost always they're going to show it very early. With the one exception being like a handcuff running back who the starter gets hurt in week 13. Stuff like that you might have popping up. Or like in a super flex league, if a team makes a quarterback change at midseason, you're going to get some good quality waiver prospects popping up at midseason. But by and large, 90% of waiver wire picks are going to bust. And the good ones are going to show it early. So I'm big on... I think the correct data-driven approach is very early in the season, within the first week, 2, 3, pick whoever you think is the best option and just shoot a giant wad of free agent bidding bucks at it. In leagues where you can make free pickups after your budget's expired, I won't even think twice about dropping 100% on a guy and just getting the guy, because odds are all of that free agent budget's going to go to waste anyway. It's going to be useless. It's not going to do anything of value. And spending it all doesn't prevent me from still making those speculative week early, 2 week early pickups, which is where most of the good stuff is really unearthed. So I'm big on, and also too, just from a peace of mind standpoint, like it's nice, you know, you don't want to, should I bid 72% or 74% or maybe I bet you somebody else is going to be debating that. So I could go 76% just to beat him. Oh no, but maybe I'm at 71. Like
but some people
payoff,
like that drama. Not me, but yeah.
And if you do, go for it. But like in terms of cost benefit, the amount of payoff you're going to get from trying to perfectly optimize your waiver bids it's not 0, but it's a rounding error away from 0. So I say just spend it, be done with it. Try to make a bunch of anticipatory moves during the year. One of the key rules for roster building is if a guy's on the end of your bench, you want to fill it with guys who you're going to find out within a week or two whether you have something. Not guys, you don't want to devote the last spot on your bench to a guy who might break out in week 9. If you're thinking like, oh, this guy might come along 8 weeks from now, Because really, you should think about those not as like, it's not one spot, it's 17 weekly spots. And so when you're holding a guy for 8 weeks, you're not burning one roster spot. You're burning 8 of your 17 weekly spots on it, compared to you could get 4 2-week guys and turn over, get 4 times as much information out of that spot. So that's my big thing is I first guy who catches my eye, I just blow a huge cannon at him to try and get him, whatever it costs. I don't really worry about, I overbid the other guy by 30% of the budget. Oh, well, I wasn't going to do anything with that 30% anyway. That's fine. And then I try to, for the rest of the year, I look at like, who am I going to get more information on in the next 2 weeks? And I always want my last couple roster spots to be working on, like they're buying me information. So that's my big waiver philosophy.
Yeah.
And
let's stop there for a minute and go, and then we'll move on about some other the other 2 topics. But I'll add to that is that an article like the replacements, what I do at Footballguys on Friday starting next week, it will be driven towards helping you look for preemptive additions. Players that you should be thinking about either adding, dropping, or maybe holding for a short period of time, and trying to give you information about them that will help you see keys as to what to do about them in each of those ways. So, for instance, Christopher Brooks is a good example of a running back who, got cut by the Dolphins. By all accounts, everyone felt like that he was a good talent. You could see what he did on the field when he was healthy, and it was intriguing. In theory, he's a good fit for the Green Bay Packers. If he gets an opportunity to play. But what we're waiting to see is, will he get added to the active roster? And if he gets added to the active roster, does he start to get snaps even with Marshawn Lloyd and Emmanuel Wilson in there? Right now, you're not looking to add this guy, but it may be something that, in a cup, maybe in 3 or 4 weeks, I may be looking at him after we see Marshawn Lloyd fumble the ball 8 million times, or Emmanuel Wilson not be able to read the creases right, or Josh Jacobs get hurt, and see the news enough to say, okay, you need to preemptively add him after what we saw in this game this week, and you can get him for free, and then wind up with a player who might end up being your end of your starter. Those are the types of things that we want you to look at from that standpoint. So
yeah, and you have to remember, if a guy's on the street, the reason he's there is because the consensus of your league is that he's not valuable. He has no value. And so the only way that guy can matter is if you're wrong. And so you're looking for guys who can prove me wrong the fastest. Like, I'm not adding this guy because I want him. You're basically buying an option to decide if you want him next week. You get right of first refusal next week. Like, everybody decides, do I want this guy? Well, he's on your roster. You get the first choice. And if you don't, cut him loose and grab somebody else. Like, buy some more options. But you've got to be putting those end of roster spots to work.
Yeah. No, and I think that, for some people, you may look at that and say, well, it's such a dispassionate view, but that's kind of, you want a logical view for how you're going to get better at what you do. The passion is winning. The passion is being able to build something there. It's not just the players. You can, if you enjoy the fact that you want to see a player that you really feel good about do well, that's very gratifying on some level. But, the priority is, how do you build the team?
And I would say, too, philosophically, just because they're on the street doesn't mean they're not on your roster too. The waiver wire is essentially your practice squad. Yeah. It's like NFL teams; they have a practice squad, but any team is free to sign from that practice squad. Use your watch list like a practice squad, and be like, these are the guys I like. They're going to be on my practice squad. Theoretically, some other team can sign them away if I don't act quickly enough, and so I do want to be wary of that. But it turns your 20-man roster into a 30-man roster because you've got the 20 guys on your active, plus there's 10 guys on the street who you're kind of keeping an eye on and keeping tabs on. And I feel like it makes it less dispassionate. It lets you invest in more players and keep an eye on them over time. I have the example from my oldest Dynasty league is Richie James, where I think I'm finally out on Richie James, but I probably dropped him and added him from my team like 10 times over the years, where I'm like, okay, I always kind of like Richie James, but I know he's not going anywhere. I can stash him on the wire, and then, oh, something might be changing. Let's add him just as a preemptive, like in case something happens, and then nothing happened. Okay, back on the wire, back on the practice squad. And so he's never, he's only spent a dozen weeks on my team, but I still feel like he's part of my squad.
Two different winning philosophies, common player, even on a low end kind of thing, or in terms of how we look at that. So what about players that you pivot from? When do you pivot from players early, or wait a little bit later when you're in a redraft situation?
I mean, that's really hard. In redraft, it's more straightforward. I always write that for the first 3 weeks of the season, everything that we thought baked into preseason ADP is more predictive than everything we've learned over the first 3 weeks. And then after 4 weeks, those reach parity, where if you look at it, production through 4 weeks is as predictive of rest of year production as preseason ADP was. So I'm always very slow to pivot off of my preseason opinions, at least through the first month. I need to see at least 4 weeks of, and I'm adjusting. If I thought, oh, this guy's going to be amazing and he's been terrible, maybe I'm adjusting my opinion down to like, okay, maybe he'll be pretty good. Or vice versa. I thought this guy was going to be terrible and he's blowing up. Although I tend to be actually, no, thinking about it, I was going to say I tend to be much quicker to move people up the rankings, but no, I don't think I am. I think I'm pretty skeptical of early season standouts as well. So for redraft, 4 weeks is the magic mark, where that's the point where what we've seen so far is basically perfectly as predictive as what we thought we knew coming into the year. And then everything after that, like results to date, should definitely carry more weight. But preseason ADP should never be entirely phased out. Like even in week 16, if you're deciding between two guys to add on waivers, and one of them was like a 3rd round pick at the beginning of the year who's underperformed and gotten cut, and the other was, like an undrafted, I might lean towards the 3rd round pick because maybe we were right and just something's been holding him back. Or so redraft 4 weeks is kind of the magic number. It's really what we've seen gets more and more important as the year goes on, and what we thought we knew gets less and less important, but neither is ever at 0. Dynasty is a much harder one because you're not just trying to predict the rest of the year, you're really trying to predict the rest of careers. And a lot of times, okay, there's this guy that we really liked because we thought he was a good talent, and then after 4 weeks, he's done nothing.
Jermaine Burton.
Sure. Yeah. Or Trey McBride in Arizona. Had that terrible rookie year, but I was quite high on him coming out. And so from a redraft perspective, after 4 or 5 weeks, I'm like, okay, it's not happening this year. It's rare for rookie tight ends to have a good rookie year. Not impossible, as Laporta and Kincaid showed last year. But, maybe I was holding out some hope that he could buck the trend. He's not going to buck the trend. He's going to be terrible this year. But a lot of times, from a single season perspective, a lot of times a player is doing really well or really poorly is just an exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. Maybe injuries around them, maybe like Darren McFadden. He was the same player talent-wise from the beginning of his career to the end of his career. In certain schemes, he was exceptionally productive. In certain other schemes, he was exceptionally unproductive. If we are basing our opinion of McFadden based on how productive he is at any given time, we're going to be swinging from he's a top 5 running back to like he's completely unrosterable in Dynasty. And the reality is he's a solid, serviceable running back. A team can use him as a starter. If it's a good scheme fit, he'll even be a fairly productive starter. And that's how we should have been valuing him from Dynasty. So Dynasty, it's very hard. There's not like that easy mark where like, oh, after 4 weeks, we're starting to know what we're going to get, because we know what we're going to get for this year, but we don't know why. And in Dynasty is all about the why. Why is this guy producing? Why is this guy not producing? Because we're trying to estimate that talent level. You don't want to react too quickly. And if your league mates are reacting too quickly, then there's an advantage to be had in, staying the course. Like Trey McBride, if teams were cutting him late in his rookie year, and I did see some teams cut him late in his rookie year, which why are you going to draft a rookie tight end if you're not going to give him at least a year? But I saw some teams cut him. There's an advantage to saying like, oh yeah, I know he looks terrible, he's not very productive, but I'm going to update my opinion on him much slower than my league mates, and I'm going to think maybe he could turn it around and I'm going to add him. You were handsomely rewarded for that. If everybody's being too slow to react, then there's advantage to be gained by reacting quicker, where like if you're seeing something and you're like, actually, no, I don't think this guy is very good, and you trade him early before perception catches up. Or if, like Puka Nacua, if you were willing to react after 1 or 2 weeks and be like, oh yeah, I think this guy is potentially a top 12 wide receiver, and you're willing to trade for him at like wide receiver 18, wide receiver 19 prices, which you easily could have gotten him for, you made a huge profit off of that because you were quicker than your league mates. So I don't really have any good advice there other than don't react too fast and don't react too slow. Just react at exactly the right speed, and you're going to do great in Dynasty.
And I would say if I were going to give a simplistic guideline based off of that, I would say if you had a rookie draft, you have a rookie draft that's, say, at least 5 rounds, your top 36 picks, if you picked a player in the top 36, they should at least be on your roster for a full year. At least a full year. And they need, and I would argue 2, unless they show they're a colossal failure in terms of maturity, off the field, or, career-ending injury. That would be probably where I would go from that standpoint. I would say any quarterback, I would just say don't draft a quarterback unless I'm going to jokingly say this. Don't draft a quarterback unless I tell you it's okay. But really the answer is that you're safer to pick to trade for quarterbacks who are established veterans than it is probably to draft a quarterback odds wise. That's kind of my view. But
see, I'm the complete opposite of you on that, where, like I said, I'm just drafting for talent. And so the league where I didn't spend any picks on running backs, I think like 80% of my second round picks were late seconds, and I just burned them on quarterbacks because everybody's like, oh, I don't want to draft a quarterback. I don't want to wait. And so you had like top 3 NFL draft picks falling to the late second round. And I'm like, okay, well, I could draft this 5th round running back, or like CJ Stroud, who was the second pick in the draft.
Yeah, but those are good examples of like where I'm getting at is like, you're not I wouldn't be burning picks on an Aiden O'Connell type of player or a Hendon Hooker type of player. But if when Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes fell to me past the first round in a draft, of course I'm taking them. But like I'm talking about, or Michael Penix is another example of a player who fell to like the 3rd round all year, and I'm taking him all year long. But that's because if you view the guy as a first round pick, I'm totally there with you. But if you're viewing it as like, if you're like, well, Hendon Hooker could be good in a few years, no, I'm not going there.
Yeah, my stance on rookies is if they were like a top 10, top 12 draft pick, or like in the case of someone like Lamar Jackson, like a 1st round pick, but with that extra juice for fantasy where the rushing is as super productive, super valuable, I'm all in on those guys. And if they were drafted in the 2nd round or later, I'm just not taking them. Like, it's not happening. We could be in the 5th round of the draft. I know the hit rates. Highly drafted quarterbacks are like 50-50. That's free money at the end of the 2nd round. Anybody past, like, the NFL is so quarterback needy and so quarterback hungry that anybody with a pulse is not falling out of the 1st round. And so if you get like a Will Levis who's like falling to what was it, the 3rd, and he showed some stuff when he had some starts, but ultimately those guys are not.
Closing time at happy hour. That's basically what's going on there, or after happy hour. Yeah.
There's the occasional Tony Romo, and I'm going to miss out on the Tony Romos every time, and I can live with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you that if you're spending this high rookie pick on a guy and you're not willing to give him at least a year, why are you, spend that pick on somebody who you're willing to give the leash to? Yeah. I would guess the big distinction I'd make between redraft and dynasty is in redraft, you only need to know the what. Will this guy be productive? Will this guy not be productive? But in dynasty, it's important to look at the why. Because we're not trying to estimate, will this guy be productive this year or not? That's a component of dynasty, and it's good to have a little bit of that to compete for this year. But the dominant component of dynasty is, will this guy be productive over the long haul? And the best predictor of that is this guy a good player or not? So we can look at, he's probably not going to be productive this year, and that's evidence towards the theory of whether he's good or not. But that's not the thing we're trying to estimate. So I think it's Yeah, it's really just a mindset thing where, like in Dynasty, you're saying, is this guy good or is this guy not good?
And I think a way to kind of refine that mindset is to look at it this way, because I think the common thing I see, especially as someone who's always talking about late round guys to look at, players that I think are more talented than what the maybe everyone else thinks, like the Chris Brookses, You don't want to fall in love with these players to the point that you're holding on to them longer than you should. But you shouldn't also... People tend to look at things as extremes. They're either in love or they hate them, or they've written them off, And you should do neither with these players. You should understand that, Christopher Brooks is a good player. And he's a good player looking for an opportunity, which means... he's not ready for your rosters yet unless you just have a luxury to keep him on there because there's nobody else that you particularly like right now that's going to suit that criteria. But you should also be prepared that he might be on 2 more teams before the year's over or by next year. And he may never get an opportunity. And if he does, you're going to hear people say, well, he got written off long ago, And that's the thing that you have to understand about this, is that you have to look at it as going, you can appreciate a player, and just because he's good doesn't mean that an NFL team's going to give him the opportunity to show how good he can be. Raheem Mostert, again, was a great example of a player who was on 7 different teams until the 49ers said, yeah, let's give him an opportunity. So if you can look at it that way, you're going to feel better about rotating him on and off your roster. And if you miss on him because you had him once and you lost him, get over it. It's okay. I mean, you let one get away. There's more out there for you.
And you can look too at, like, again, I always encourage people to look at their league's history, because we all have these intuitions about how things work, and they seldom match the reality. Like, what percentage of the time when a player gets cut does another team add him within a week? It's like 2% of the time.
Right.
Like, it never happens. Think about it. If Chris Brooks is on your roster, it's because you are the highest manager on him. Yep. And if you're considering cutting him, it's not like somebody else is going to be scooping him up. Like, you're the highest and you're cutting him. Everybody else is probably lower than you. They're not going to be adding him. They don't have that emotional investment in him because he's been on their roster already. So it's very easy most of the time to cut a guy and he's on your practice squad. You haven't gotten rid of him. NFL teams do it all the time. There's a tons of players on their practice squad who are freely available. Any other team can sign them. But think about it at the NFL level. How often are teams really poaching? How big is the practice squad now? It's like 10 guys, 20 guys. I don't even know. But there's hundreds of players on squads, and how many of them are being poached every week?
Yeah. Be emotional about the right things. Be emotionally invested in winning. Be emotionally invested in making wise decisions. Be emotionally invested in looking at talent over need. If you do that, then you can kind of get past your affection for a specific player and you being right on the player. People spend too much time worrying about being right about the player because they get on social media, they look at all of us touting players, or they're touting players themselves and want to say, I was right about this player. Who gives a fuck if you're right about the player? If you were right about enough players to be outscoring everybody. And that's really what you have to keep in mind. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes.
Also, too, winning cures everything. Maybe you're not as emotionally invested in the guy you replace Brooks with on your roster, but if that guy produces points, you're gonna love him pretty quickly.
Yes, exactly.
I'm a Chris Brooks fan, and I'm not a fan of this guy. I traded for Rachaad White this offseason because the price was right. I mean, he was. I thought too discounted. I'm not a huge Rachaad White fan, but I guarantee you, if he has a top 12 fantasy football finish this year, I'm going to be a huge Rachaad White fan, and I'm going to be talking about how right I was to trade for him. And I don't know that that's especially likely. Like I said, at this point, he hasn't produced for me, so I'm not all that emotionally invested in him. I'm like, it works, it works. I drafted his backup because I've been hearing some hype on that, and if it doesn't work, hopefully I can benefit from the backup. And but yeah, there's nothing that'll make you fall in love with a player more than getting them for free, and all of a sudden they're in your lineup and they're making a difference.
And I can tell you, as someone who has Sean Tucker, the third string back, on multiple deep dynasty leagues, he'll be rotating on and off my roster multiple times throughout the year. I mean, as an example of that, I love the idea of what he could do, but I'm not gonna hold on to him, at the detriment of getting other players who can help me right now. So, let's finish this off with a couple more topics. One is kickoffs. The kickoffs have changed. You've been looking forward to some of that. I know that you've done some research on that. We've talked about a little bit upcoming last year, but I'd love for you to revisit that for this episode now that it's here and people don't have to just imagine the idea of it in the abstract. They actually get to see it.
Yeah. So to start with, you need to understand how kickoffs were 20 years ago. Let's say 2004, 2005. At that point, kickers were kicking off from the 30. Kickers were not as strong-legged as today's kickers. So they could not get touchbacks regularly. The best kickers in the league were getting 15, 20% touchback rate. David Akers, I think, was the best at touchbacks. And it's a 20% touchback rate. That was huge. What a weapon Akers was. But kickoffs are a very dangerous play. It's really the only play in the game where you're going to have two sides both running at full speed, but by the time they hit each other, because they're starting at opposite sides of the field and they both have enough time to get up ahead of steam and they're slamming into each other. And most fans don't really notice that it's such a dangerous play because the injuries are happening to players that are not on our radar. Because it's so dangerous, teams are not putting their good players on kickoffs. That's the end of the roster bunch. But those players, I'm going to suggest something controversial. Those players are people too, and they matter, and we should not be sacrificing their health and well-being just solely for our entertainment. So the NFL rightly said, this play is too dangerous. We're going to try to reduce the number of kickoffs, and we're going to try and reduce the number of injuries that way. So the first thing they did is they moved the kickoff from the 30 to the 35, which made touchbacks a lot easier to achieve. And especially combined with improvements in kicker quality, which have been almost linear basically over the league's life. And then they brought touchbacks out from the 20 to the 25 to encourage teams to take that touchback more often. And so those two changes, I believe 2011 with the new CBA was the first year they went into play. Kickoff return rate in the mid 2000s was generally north of 90%, 88 to 94% of kickoffs wound up being returned. After those rule changes, it dropped to about 60%, and then there was a steady decline from there. It kind of took the league a little while to catch on that actually, no, taking these touchbacks is a bit more optimal than attempting the returns. And then the strategy shifted where kickers were intentionally, they could have booted it out of the end zone if they wanted to, but instead they're placing the ball kind of at the front of the end zone, and they're daring the other team to return it because they know they'll gain a few yards if the other team, returning is the suboptimal decision. They're trying to beat that decision. So return rates dropped to kind of the low 40% in 2022. But it was still a lot of injuries. And then rather than addressing the root cause that there's a lot of injuries on this play, the NFL is well, let's just keep reducing the number of kickoffs. So last year they implemented a rule that said even if the ball is kicked into the field of play, anybody can call a fair catch and take the touchback. You bring the ball out. And so as a result of that, basically every kickoff, it's a fair catch. The league's return rate fell to, I believe, 22% last year. And would probably have declined further from there, because if we've seen anything, it's that the league typically takes a few years to adjust to the new rule and kind of land on the optimal rate. And that triggered this huge backlash where, okay, if 80% of the time, probably moving to 90% of the time, the kickoff is just symbolic. You're just kicking it, and then the other team's taking the touchback and starting with the ball. Why even have this? You're just wasting everybody's time. There's still not zero injuries, so you're still getting some injuries for a play that just doesn't matter. Why does this even exist? When the extra point started to get too automatic, the league moved the extra point back a little bit to add a little bit more variance and to justify its existence. The league wanted to do something similar with kickoffs, and they wanted to justify its existence. So the competition committee got together and they looked at various other rule proposals. The XFL had one that they had been workshopping and they'd spent a lot of time working on, and had been very successful for them. The basic proposal is that instead of lining up at opposite ends of the field and running full speed and crashing into each other, you have both teams line up very close to each other, but nobody can move until the ball is fielded. And then you don't have time to get that amount of speed. So the injury rate on that play should theoretically be about the same as any other play from scrimmage, which is fine. Like, we don't need it to be lower than any other play. We just want the injury rate to be the same as any other play. It's just a play like any others. And so the XFL did that. And they had like a 90+ return rate, but it bore out that the injury rate was very low. So the NFL said, that's cool. This is a really good, exciting proposal. We're going to adopt this. And so they tried to get it passed in March with touchbacks. The XFL, part of the rule was that touchbacks came out to the 35-yard line, which means that touchbacks are very, very punitive. You do not want to kick touchbacks because it gives the other team just fantastic starting field position. 35, that's almost where, like, if you kick the ball out of bounds, the team gets it on the 40 currently, and that's hugely punitive. Just a standard touchback is almost to that point. So that was a big driver.
2 first downs and you're kicking a field goal at least.
Right. That was a big driver behind the 90+ return rate in the XFL. The NFL tried to pass that, but a lot of old guard teams, very conservative, very traditionalist, said, no, we're not going to vote with the 35% touchback rate. So the competition committee said, okay, let's do it with touchbacks coming out to the 30, which is where they came out to before. And let's try it like that for a year. And that got them enough votes. I think they got 31 out of 32. So that got them enough votes. So this is technically a 1-year trial. But when people hear that it's a 1-year trial, they think it's going to be like this for a year and then potentially they could move back to the old way. Realistically, it's more likely that the league is going to do this for a year, and then next year they're going to push to bring touchbacks to the 35 to increase the kickoff return rate even more. So it looks weird in terms of outcomes of the play. And I think this is important to understand. It functions very similar to the old kickoffs, where kicks that are returned will come to pretty much exactly the same point that the old kickoffs used to come out to. Touchbacks come to the same point. It looks different, but if you're just looking at a spreadsheet of like the play-by-play, like on a spreadsheet, it's going to look very much like the old kickoff, but it will increase return rate because if it lands in the field to play, you have to return it. And if it lands in the field to play and bounces into the end zone, the touchback only comes out to the 20. So there's no like sneaking around that. If it's hitting in the field to play, you pretty much have to return it. But it should drop the injury rate substantially. The league has had their statisticians model the impact, and the statisticians modeled with touchbacks coming out to the 35, we expect like a 90% return rate. With them only coming out to the 30, we expect somewhere in the 50 to 60% range. Which is still a dramatic uptick over last year's 22%, which was by far the lowest in history, and will kind of make the play interesting again. The league also polled special teams coordinators, and they said the same thing, that we're expecting about a 50 to 60% return rate. There's some speculating. I know Mike Florio has been very vocal about like, the play looks weird and teams aren't going to want to risk it, and so I'm expecting a very low return rate. I don't think it's any riskier from the kicking team's perspective than the old style kickoffs, where like it's no more likely to result in a long return for a touchdown. It's just going to look a little different.
Is this the first and last time we will ever quote Mike Florio on this show?
Hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I just wanted to make sure that you and I were on the same page.
I'm always happy to bring him up to discuss ways in which he's wrong, because he's got a voice. People listen to him. He is influential.
He does have a voice.
I do think that
it's a fucking annoying voice. Okay,
yes.
I'm sorry. He's the only person I think I'll ever talk that way about, but sorry. All right.
The thing I don't like about him is he's just so confident, and I feel like it's an unearned confidence. But he's just like convinced, like this is what I think is going to happen, and it's not like this is what I think is going to happen. It's I think it's going to happen, so therefore it's going to happen. So
I just know that he hates the draft.
Yeah.
And I also know that I also suspect that he was not kind to the careers of some people who've done very well since they exited his orb of his radius of influence, and so that's what I'll just keep it there. All right. Anyway.
Yeah. So I project. I don't know if people know. I've been projecting returns for Footballguys for basically since I joined them. I've been involved in it in 2013. I have a decade there, and I've been like entirely in charge of it since 2016 or 2017. And it's been kind of fun. I mean, returns have just been dwindling in importance year after year after year after year, like just dwindling to irrelevance. And I kind of thought we were going to continue to do that. And I expected one year Footballguys would come to me and be like, all right, we just don't care about returns anymore.
Right.
You can stop doing that. Because they really haven't mattered in a while. So the change is exciting for me because, and especially if, as I anticipate that they're going to move the touchbacks out next year and we're back up to like a 90% return rate, suddenly returns will be very productive. And in leagues that still have kickoff return scoring, like suddenly this is going to matter. And I think more leagues are going to look into perhaps adding it because there's going to be yardage there. It's going to be an interesting twist like tight end premium, or it's just something you can do to differentiate your league and give talented managers another facet to consider. So that's exciting for me. And it's kind of I really like it about Footballguys that they've continued to invest in this area that like didn't matter for so long, and now that it does matter, they have this baseline of experience and knowledge. Because I mean, I don't want to be mean or anything, but I've seen some like return analysis that's been cropping up now that this suddenly matters, and it's clearly been done by people who have been following this for the past decade, and they don't have that like baseline context and understanding to like really get what's going on, and they can't really. If you don't know exactly what the rules were last year, it's going to be very hard to dive into the nuances.
Yeah, they're just behind the curve at this stage.
Right, and that's fine. They can build that up, but I like that, we've kind of had that start. But I've seen like some people predicting like a 90% return rate because that's what the XFL had. And it's like, well, but you don't understand the crucial context difference. Like they're lining up differently. The touchbacks are only coming out to the 30. And then, there's some people who are predicting like, oh, this is going to be completely irrelevant because like, why would teams want to risk it? And they don't understand the context that it's really no riskier in terms of field position than the old style kickoff. So I'm very excited for it, not least because, when I've been doing a thing for a decade that was just steadily dwindling in importance, it's exciting that like, oh, now there's going to be a payoff to all that work. And because I love return leagues. I love any kind of rule or twist that makes more players relevant and that gives you more areas to consider. And I know it's optimistic. I know return scoring is never going to be a majority of the hobby, but I would love to see that become a bigger facet of fantasy leagues over the next couple of years, and see more interesting players. I controversially suggested that the players on the end of the roster they matter and have moral worth too. And so it'll be fun to see some of those players, like Keyshawn Nixon in IDP leagues or
Darius Davis.
Yeah, Cavante Turpin. Like all of a sudden, like these guys are startable fantasy players. My oldest Dynasty league has always had return scoring. And Devin Hester was my wide receiver 3 for a number of years, because like, okay, he's not super productive as a receiver, but he's getting enough returns to supplement that. And I think it's good for fantasy for an all-time great like Devin Hester to actually matter. Tyler Lockett, when he was young, was like a top 12 fantasy wide receiver every year because he always supplemented his offensive production with returns. And I just think that makes things more fun. There's the more players we can care about, the better.
Yeah, I mean, growing up, I remember valuing players like Billy White Shoes Johnson and Rick Upchurch. I mean, those were guys that were really well-known commodities before fantasy was really in the spectrum, outside of just news reporters who did this as a hobby for fun a little bit here and there. But I mean, I think that's a great explanation. If you want to learn more about that, just go to Footballguys, look at the little magnifying glass in the upper right-hand corner, type in Adam Harstad, and you're going to see his articles there. and you're going to see when it says kickoff returns are changing. Here's why it matters. Also, he did a Scott Fishbowl 14 5 returners to know back in July if you happen to be drafting late and adding a return component to it. But I'll just humanize the story a little bit about this, just about the danger of kickoffs, because what you brought up reminded me of my buddy Ryan Riddle, who was a former, Cal defensive end and still their single season sack record holder during the Aaron Rodgers, Marshawn Lynch era of football. And he played for a number of NFL teams as an outside linebacker and defensive end for a while. And about 10 years ago, I was out in LA on an assignment, and I got to visit with him and stay with him for a little bit. We went to check out a UCLA BYU game. We saw Josh Rosen versus Taysom Hill, in the Rose Bowl, and that was a fun experience. But I remember we were sitting there eating lunch beforehand, and Ryan is one of these guys that he never got hurt on a football field. He was about 6'4", 260 pounds. Was a very intellectual and intuitive pass rusher in terms of technique and the game within the game. And I asked him just once, but he was one of those guys. He's one of these guys when you get to know him. I love Ryan to death. He's one of my good friends. He is a complete cinephile. He has a very there's an innocence about him. Like when you talk with him, he's the type of person that will ask you questions that has like this childlike curiosity. Very smart man. Takes a very analytical approach to studying draft prospects that he did for a while. But he also, when he asks questions, sometimes people think he's trolling when it's really just a very innocent curiosity that comes out very bluntly about things. So I remember asking him, I just said, so tell me about the best hit you ever delivered. And Ryan, he's just like this gentle giant of a guy. That's how I describe him, almost childlike in a good way, And as he starts describing this play, it was against Stanford, and he was on a kick return, covering on a kick return up the right flat. And he said, and as I'll tell you the play. He says, I'm heading down the field. And he said, and for whatever reason, it was just one of those moments where you get the accurate snapshot of how everything's going to unfold in front of you. And he said, and I knew just from my experience playing and covering kicks that there were two blockers in front of me, and the ball carrier was going to try and split that. And if I hit it at the right moment, I would be able to disrupt this entire thing about to happen with the runner and the returner and the two blockers. So literally from about 5 yards away, I leapt and cross-body blocked the two blockers in front of me and pushed them back into the running back and knocked them all down. And he said, when I hit them, and you could just start to see his eyes kind of glaze over, like it was something kind of changed in him. It was like this innocent person went into this kind of bloodthirsty kind of person who enjoyed the violence of the game, and enjoyed the feeling of hitting somebody. And he said, my energy went through them. He said, I could just feel like when I hit them, it was like hitting, if you ever hit a baseball so well that swing, you're just going right through and you don't even really feel like it just goes right through. He said, that's what I felt like when I hit those two dudes. He goes, and the way I hit them, though, is I hit one with my chest into his chest, and my legs whiplashed basically whipped into the frame of the other guy. He goes, they had to carry those two guys off the field, and I believe, if I remember this right, the ball carrier had to get up limping, and one of the guys had to be taken off on a stretcher. He goes, fortunately, they were all okay, like they were able to come and play football again, but one of them was out for multiple weeks and had to go to the hospital. And as he tells the story, just the look on his face, and you think about it, and you realize that in that era, punt returners and kick returners and kick coverage and people, they're a special breed of people. It's kind of like people who go to war who can compartmentalize the violence. Maybe not as dramatic as that, but there's something related to that.
So, I think about Ryan and that, and I think about when you talk about the injury rates. Like you said, the fact that it makes this exciting part of the game, brings back the exciting part of the game, while lowering the injury rate, is a good thing, and it keeps good players with potential in a situation where maybe they don't ruin their careers trying to earn their mark to get to play the position that they really specialize in.
Because that's important to remember too. If Tyreek Hill gets knocked out for 6 weeks, Tyreek Hill has a roster spot waiting for him when he comes back. If some of these kickoff coverage guys get knocked out for 6 weeks, that might be the end of their football career.
What if
even
Terrell
if they're 22,
Davis,
23. Right.
Yeah, Terrell Davis
in Japan.
In Japan, had that famous kickoff coverage where he tackled the guy and got Mike Shanahan's attention. Otherwise, he was likely to get cut.
Right.
And what if he got injured on that return?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I like the returns too. I like learning about these players. I don't know if you watched Hard Knocks at all. We were watching with the Bears, and they showed the Bears running back coach, this guy named Chad Morton. And I suspect like 99% of fans have no idea who he is. But I'm like, hey, it's Chad
Saints.
Morton. I always wondered what happened to him.
Yep.
Dude had 1,500 all-purpose yards in
Yeah.
like 3 times in 4 years from 2000
Great
to 2003.
player. Yep.
He was one of those guys. For some reason, in 2003, Washington just added as many former New York Jets as they could.
Yep.
And then I remember that the first kickoff of the year that year, Morton was standing like by the sideline, and he stood with like 1 foot out of bounds and 1 foot inbounds, and he fielded the ball, which by rule, that's a kickoff out of bounds, and the team got the ball on the 40, and like this is stuff that I love this. And if I hadn't been playing in a return league back in 2002, 2003, I never would have remembered his name. But it just, it humanizes the sport, and it gives you so much more to care about. These are the guys like literally fighting for their NFL careers, who are getting the least and putting in the most. And I just love a chance to shine a bit more of a spotlight on them.
Yeah, I mean, and just to give reference, Chad Morton started with the Saints and then was with the Jets, the Commanders, and the Giants. Had a career 5,400 yards in kick returns alone, and then another 1,400 yards in punt returns. I mean, you think about that. I mean, as a guy, at USC, who was a running back at USC, 5'8", 191. So, and I didn't know Johnny was his brother, but that makes sense. So,
and it makes it only happened because the return rates were like 90% back then. He had 1,500 kickoff return yards in a year. Last year, I think the season leader had like 600 or 700. It's just, there's not a chance. There's not a place for players to carve out a career. And even though like Morton never really got to prove himself at running back, he never really had that opportunity to play his chosen position for an extended period of time in the NFL. But he was able to carve out like a long and respectable career for himself, and he was able to. And I would like more players to have those opportunities, to be this generation's Chad Morton, or this generation's Keith Burns, who was like a special teams player for the Broncos, had like a 14-year career basically as a special teams captain, or Steve Tasker, or and those opportunities just aren't there right now.
Yeah. So give me something that's on your radar heading into the season.
I don't know. I'll be honest. It was kind of a rough off season for me. Like I'm just not at this point. I'm not where I usually am at this point in terms of like storylines to watch and things that I'm following. So I'm kind of excited. Like I said, I'm excited to get back into routines, and I think a lot of the early season is going to be more of a surprise for me than it usually is. But I'm just excited for.
That's cool.
Football.
And we'll leave it at that for now, because we got plenty more that we can talk about. I mean, certainly I've talked about Jaden Daniels and me looking forward to seeing whether or not the system, how the system's going to do. Is he going to be a Mariota Levis type of player? Robert
he was
Griffin
my
type of player?
My first round rookie pick in a league where I've already got, it's a 1 quarterback league, and I've got Mahomes, Dak Prescott, Deshaun Watson and Bryce Young. So like I don't quote unquote need quarterback, but I'm very excited to see. I always like something a little bit different. Something potentially new and something potentially exciting, rather than just like Caleb Williams. Objectively, is a phenomenal prospect, and he does some like very interesting and exciting things. But on Caleb Williams, I'm kind of like, all right, I feel like we've seen that movie before. It gets back to like Andrew Luck versus Robert Griffin, where like Luck objectively the better prospect, like a phenomenal, one of the best prospects of all time. But I was always on team like let's root for Griffin, because like we could see something potentially revelatory here, whereas Luck I feel was more, I guess you could say Luck was evolutionary and Griffin was revolutionary.
And see, I think Anthony Richardson's going to be revolutionary, but or actually maybe revolutionary isn't the right term, because I don't think there will be anyone like him for the next 20 years if he hits the way that he can hit. It'll be more like seeing a Barry Sanders, Jim Brown, Bo Jackson type of player, where you go, yeah, they don't make them like that in this era of football. But I'm with you on Jaden Daniels. I'm also looking at this and thinking, it made me go back and look at Kyler Murray, and it's just, I'm down on Marvin Harrison as a top 15 pick, because I look at this and I'm waiting to see, can Kyler Murray support multiple wide receivers? Because when I've been looking at his 3-year career thus far, where he's been healthy enough to post meaningful full season data, DeAndre Hopkins is the only player inside the top 24 that he supported, and that was wide receiver 4. And I'm not going to compare Marvin Harrison to late career venerable DeAndre Hopkins at this stage. At this point, I don't know if he's going to be able to support multiple options. Maybe you can look at it and say, well, these guys are good enough that he's going to be able to do that. But also, when you look at his data, he's always been the 3rd worst in yardage in each of those top 12 seasons. Almost 33% of his production has come from rushing. And when you look at it, because of the way, and he passes enough, obviously, to get the points, but it's the way that he does it. The why behind that is that he doesn't stay in the pocket long enough, and he bleeds plays out in a manner that I don't know if Harrison has those types of skill sets physically or conceptually to be a match immediately. So I think he's going to be a 900-yard player at best, which is like top 36 in my projections, but not top 15. You know?
Yeah, it's funny. Kyler Murray always gets compared to Russell Wilson because of the height. I feel like that's the comparison. But like play style, just like I feel like if you just graphed where they in the field when the ball is released, and you like did that for every quarterback, and you like took off the names, there's no way you would take Kyler Murray's chart and Russell Wilson's chart and say, oh yeah, it's basically like they're very similar players. It's just I agree with you that Russell's always moving inside the pocket, trying to find those little creases because of his height. He's trying to find lanes where he can see what he needs to see. Whereas Murray's just like, well, I'm never going to see it in the pocket, so let's get out so that I can see. And it's exciting to watch, but I agree with you that it's not really the sort of offense that's going to support receivers running precise routes in the structure of the offense.
I'd say the last one that I'm really interested in seeing is, I have a theory, one of the theories that we talk about a lot on this show and other shows at the RSP cast is that coaches coach to scheme, they don't coach to development of the player's skills. So when I hear a coach like Jim Harbaugh say, Quentin Johnston catches the ball really well, and he's been, he's always been a good pass catcher. I look at that and say, that's a guy who doesn't study the player's tape. Because Quentin Johnston on certain targets catches the ball really well. On the ones that matter, that would differentiate his athletic ability at a high level, he's been mixed at best, which is those contested catch targets where you jump up and track the ball well in a contested scenario, fades, different types of throws downfield in the vertical game where he could really leverage his size and length. And that's where he's failed.
So if Jim Harbaugh says he's having a really good camp and he's putting things together and he's getting better, and that Sanjay Lal deserves credit for that, who's been known as a pretty good wide receiver coach, even though the Bills would tell you that maybe early on that was a little more hype than needed to be. You look at this and you wonder, whether they're just speaking to the media and hyping up a guy and don't really know the details of his game. So I want to see if he's really improved with the tracking. Because if he has, then I can look at Jim Harbaugh and go, okay, I trust you with this area of what you're discussing. If not, I'm just going to look at you and add you to the long list of coaches on the dumpster fire who, when you start talking about player development, I'd rather hear you talk about scheme. So
Yeah, there's this common conception that coaches lie a lot, that coaches are not honest, that they're saying something they know is untrue for a specific purpose. Maybe it's a ploy to motivate Tatum Bell, I don't know, but there's this common perception, and I'm like, if you dig into it, that's really not the case. Yeah. Coaches actually tend to be surprisingly honest. The problem is a lot of times they just don't know what they're talking about.
Yes, there's got a lot of moving parts.
Right. Maybe he genuinely believes that Johnston is a great catcher. Doesn't mean it's true. It just means he believes it's true. The famous one was Bruce Arians. Oh, Bruce Arians always lies about a starting running back. No, he doesn't. He's honest at the time. It's just he's wrong, and he changes his mind.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. We have to remember, we'll end it with this, we have to remember that football has a lot of silos. And if you're managing all those silos, you're not an expert in all those silos. And if the structure of those silos is set up that development is on the player and their coaches away from the game, then you really don't have to know about those types of things. And that's why when you watch the NFL 100, and I joke that all the players, 95% of the players, when they talk about another player, is like, he's big, ugh, he's fast, ugh, he's strong, ugh, and that's basically what's going on. And then occasionally you get someone like a Tom Brady who breaks down their technique and conceptual knowledge of the game, or somebody does that. When a player does that, my antenna goes up, and I'm like, okay, that's a player who's really into studying the craft of the game. Otherwise, they're all just impressed about the same shit everybody else is, which is size and speed, and I understand it can be awe-inspiring, but at the same time, the players who make the most improvements are the ones who get beyond that and figure out, how am I going to last in this game for a long time and be able to make those plays with a small margin of error, and a narrow margin of difference between winning and losing. So, well, listen, this has been a fun show. I've been looking forward pretty much for the past 6 months to get a chance to revisit with Adam, and I'm looking forward for us doing this, on Thursdays, and being able to do this show. I can't stress enough, if you want to get just quality content at Footballguys, and there's a lot of quality content at Footballguys, but if you want to get some of the best content at Footballguys, just look up Adam Harstad's name in the search bar. Check out things like the Dynasty in Theory, How Does It Work in Practice, that he wrote last January, or some of the things from last year. If you just want to go revisit after this on this show, I would look at things like Imagining Profiles in More Dimensions, or What's Happening to NFL Careers, that he wrote back in December. These are excellent articles that have some evergreen topics that are going to help you get better. And I just like embarrassing Adam, or at least trying to. I don't know if I have, but I'm gonna keep trying my best, at least at the end of different shows, in the same way that I tried and failed to fluster Gene Bramwell for all these years on the Audible. I'm going to make
that
this
I would need to be capable
mission.
Of shame.
Yeah. Well, we're going to try and dig deep. I might have to enlist Sigmund Bloom's couch and see if we can find any books in there on interviewing people that can elicit that. I've tucked a couple away in there. They might be moldy from the beer stains that Evan Silva probably has left on there, or something like that. But anyway, Thanks again for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. You can check us out on pretty much your favorite podcast provider. Go to mattwaldmanrsp.com and you can check it out there as well as on YouTube. Thanks again.